So can I request you all to remain seated as we are now going to discuss some of these key questions that the Minister has actually posed before all of us. This is the opener, so we are going to discuss experiences from the different geographies these speakers come from. Let me quickly introduce them. We have Dr. Arian Sharifi. He's the Director of the National Threat Assessment at the Office of the National Security Council in Kabul. He's pretty much in ground zero, and we will get his perspectives on, and he's third to my right. He is going to, of course, give you a very original perspective from someone who is responding to this on a daily basis. We have Assan Ali to my immediate right. He is working with the Commonwealth Secretariat in the CVE unit, and we will discuss his work and his mandate in this particular role. We have Farah Pandith, who's a scholar with the Council on Foreign Relations, and she's had the distinct privilege, if I can call it that, of working with Bush Senior, Bush Junior, and Obama, right? And advising them on their engagements with the community. She was the special rep to the Muslim community in a last avatar in government, and she has been writing and engaging with this subject for a long while. And finally, we have Raffaello, and I was Raffaello Pantucci from RUSI in the UK, and I was quite taken up with the title of his book, which is on the urban challenge around the CVE. His book is titled We Love Death as You Love Life, Britain's Suburban Terrorists. And he's going to bring a British perspective pretty much on the mess the British created. So if we were to call this the incomplete transition to democracies post the period of colonization. So sorry for being a little cheeky there, Raffaello. Let me start with Farah. Farah, we've heard different takes on violent extremism and the efforts to counter them. And we have heard from some that it's a new effort. In this particular avatar, it's an age-old effort in many societies in any case. But in this current decadal avatar, the US has actually been responsible for shaping it. And you have been part of that team that thought up of this particular framework. So let me start with you. Why CVE? What was the essential purpose of this particular project? And where have you reached? Have you succeeded? What are the markers that we should judge this program's success by?
So good evening, everyone. And I want to thank the organizers for this event. I think it's really important to have this conversation here in India for a lot of different reasons. But I also think it's a moment of reflection. One of your speakers just now talked about sort of a pivot point tomorrow on a very strategic conversation summit that's happening not too far from here. But I'd also say this is a strategic moment for India to be thinking about this issue. One of your speakers also said, may have even been you. You've only been doing this for a year. So what does it mean to be a new effort? That's the one thing I would say to you. The concept of youth protection around the issue of ideology is not new. And it is new, the manifestation of this is in a post-9/11 world. And I really want to say that because that's what, in fact, we're talking about today, even though the subject of your event for the next couple of days isn't specifically about groups like ISIS or AQ or the Taliban or Boko. I want to be clear that when the National Security Strategy was written in 2006 out of the Bush administration, where President Bush was talking about defeating a battle with a battle of arms and a battle of ideas. That ideological struggle is how we began as the United States thinking about how do we protect youth from violent ideologies. And when we defined it, Samir, to be very clear, it wasn't just about AQ. It was also about, and we should be talking about, the far right as well, because they're both connected. As I have a very intelligent audience in front of us, I don't have to spell this out for you, but that's important. Moving down the last 10 years is really the modern manifestation of what we're now calling CVE. And the conversation about how do you stop a young person from finding an ideology of us versus them, something that they move towards is exactly what that is the thing that we are doing. This is not a kinetic conversation. This is a non-kinetic. And what CVE is about, as we defined it, was getting localized communities on the ground to give us many different tools, offline and online, to prevent the cycle of that young child moving towards violence. And in the context of 9/11, what we absolutely know, talking about it from the definitional point around the kind of terrorism that we're talking about here today, as special representative, I had the chance to travel around the world to almost 100 countries. And there's one point, one pivot point that is connected across the board, and it doesn't have to do with poverty, and it doesn't have to do if you're a Muslim living in a Muslim majority country, or you're a Muslim living as a minority. There is one data point that connects the generation that grew up post 9/11, and that is identity. What does it mean to be a Muslim? And how can I be modern and Muslim? And the loudest voices that have answered that question have not come from the corners of this world that we want them to. They have come from extreme organizations that are pulling those kids in a direction. So when you ask me, where did we begin? It began in earnest in the post-9/11 framework, and then more specifically in the Bush administration after the Danish cartoon crisis happened, when we began to experiment with what we call countering violent extremism, where the government can do one thing and one thing only: to be the convener, to be the facilitator, and to be the intellectual partner with the ideas that we hear on the ground, which means government has a limited role, communities have a gigantic role, and where are we today? We have failed miserably in the 10 years since we started. And why? We are not giving the kind of platform to civil society that we need to. Government has not stood up that kind of machinery. And two, shame on us for not getting the private sector on board the way we should have to give the kind of tools to local communities that they need. So my assessment, and that is in fact what I've been doing for the last 3 years, is writing a book on how to stop young kids from finding this appealing, and it's called How We Win. And it was written because we are not winning. We are not in a place, despite 10 years of working at this, to say that with 1/4 of the planet that's Muslim, and nearly 1 billion Muslims under the age of 30, that we're anywhere near the kind of machinery that we need globally to be able to say we are defeating the ideology of us versus them.
Farah, let me also pose another question to you. Sitting in New Delhi, we get a sense that much of the CVE effort in its modern avatar has been focused on the Southwest and West Asia. It has not necessarily been holistic in its effort to bring out and tease out examples and ideas and experiences from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, India, and I think many patches of the community which could perhaps have contributed to the larger effort have been left out of the American-led efforts in its modern avatar.
So I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you. Because whether it is Trinidad and Tobago, whether it's Mauritania, whether it's Australia, whether it's Denmark, or whether it's Indonesia, the American effort to listen to voices on the ground has been going on. Here's where all of us have failed. You can't just be in an ivory tower trying to pick out what NGOs are doing a good job. Nor can you decide which Muslims are the good Muslims and which Muslims are the bad Muslims. You need a ground force on the ground who is committed to listening, to engaging, to spend the time, and no country in the world, shame on all of us, has done that. So Samir, it's not that we haven't gone to India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Indonesia or Malaysia or Singapore and said, tell me what you're doing to actually build up the kind of initiatives that we know, offline and online, that will make a difference to these young people. It is, what do you do to build the scale that we need? And we haven't had the kind of scale that would allow us to actually have the system in place.
No, and the private sector, you touched on the role of the private sector. And where do you think we've gone wrong there?
Everywhere. Now, here's where the Europeans have led. The private sector, I don't just mean technology companies. Please don't get me wrong, but the technology companies do have a very important role to play. The Europeans have done something the Americans have not been able to do, is to push and pressure them to do more around hate speech, and they should be called out in a very favorable way in that way. But there's more to be said. everything is about data now. Behavior is about data. And what we learn and what we understand about a young person, a millennial, or Generation Z, is around how they understand their communities, how do they navigate within it, whether or not they're deciding to buy this kind of water or wear a black suit. We have a lot of data that talks about the cultural listening aspects. We have not asked private sector companies to help us in the cultural listening aspects and devote that knowledge in the sphere of youth protection. And that's something where I think there's a new frontier and there's a new opportunity to be able to do more.
Let me turn to Arian. Arian, you are pretty much at what I would still call the ground zero of the global battle to establish a modern state where you would have the radicals take over and create a regressive state, as the minister described it. You are combating men with guns who want to, take over your state, who want to kill your people. How good and how relevant are these conversations around youth protection, around the battle of ideas, around creating dialectics? How useful is it to someone sitting in Kabul to engage in this conversation? And are guns the only answer you see sitting in your particular vantage point?
Thank you, Samir.
I think it's on.
And good evening, everyone. Since you will have the misfortune of having me on another panel tomorrow, so with your permission, I thought I would get into the more specifics of Afghanistan's experience in CVE tomorrow, and then now share just a few words in general terms about some of the main conclusions that we can potentially draw from this long and unfortunate experience that we have in dealing with violent extremists. And if I were to draw one major conclusion, it is that we need a long-term, comprehensive, and coherent approach to fighting violent extremists. That short-termism, individualism, and ad hoc fails. What do I mean by this comprehensive approach? Well, in my world, and much of that has to do with the kinetic and security aspect of counterterrorism, we oftentimes, in fact all the time, when analyzing an adversary's threat to our national security, we start with assessing that adversary's intentions and capabilities. So that's our starting point every time. Now, the capabilities of an adversary is fairly easy to understand. It could be summarized in what could be called as war-making resources, everything from men to fight, to guns, to finances, to training grounds, to intelligence support, et cetera, et cetera. These are tangible things, these are physical things, oftentimes done covertly, so it's not visible right there, but with proper methods of intelligence and detection, one can understand and identify those. Now, fighting and countering that is a complete different story, but at least to understand an adversary's capabilities to hurt, it is fairly easy to understand. What is really difficult is intentions. Now, why is it difficult to understand the adversary's intentions? It's because intentions are not physical things. Intentions are thoughts in the minds of people. Now, it's easy to know and understand that an adversary wants to hurt you. But why that adversary wants to hurt you, what makes that adversary to get this the extremist ideology and assume this intention to hurt is very, very difficult, in our experience at least. Ideology, in my belief, is just one small part of that intention to hurt. There is a lot more going on in the lives of the people that make them vulnerable to accepting that violent ideology, extremist ideology, and assuming that intention to hurt. So now in our experience, and over the past 2 years, a little over 2 years, we conducted field research across the country, in 7 zones of the country, at the district level, specifically on this question: what really makes individuals to join violent organizations and want to fight against their own people and their own government. There's a lot that we found. There are political factors, there are economic factors, social factors, historical issues, ethnic issues, a host of factors, issues, and grievances that make people and individuals vulnerable to this ideology of violent extremism. We have failed to come up with one comprehensive profile of an individual vulnerable. So that makes us think back and see whether or not the approach we've had so far in fighting terrorism and violent extremism has been effective. And that's what I call the need for a comprehensive approach to simultaneously work on all these different factors, combine them, make them coherent, and hopefully that would be more effective.
So let me ask you another question. How useful is it for external actors who get engaged in probing communities, doing research, creating documents and reports, for example, from this particular conference, and bringing those solutions to, say, your government, and saying, here are some of our findings, some of our discussions. How useful are these exercises? And do you think by the very act of doing this, we are actually creating a degree of resistance to an external actor, in many ways appropriating cultural responsibility?
Well, I think there's a role to be done by external actors, at least in our experience. And I agree with Farah that communities have a major role, that civil society have a major role, but I disagree that the government has a minimum role. In my view, the government has to be in the driving seat. The government has to come up with that comprehensive approach and facilitate the implementation of that comprehensive approach. Otherwise, things get ad hoc, not only in CVE, but in anything. And over the past 17 years in Afghanistan, in the field of look in the field of development, every donor has come in with their own funding, with their own programs, and look what we have. I mean, the effectiveness of donor funding in the development field has been extremely, extremely small in our country. The same thing, even so, more could be said about fighting violent extremism. This is a task that really needs to be driven by the central government of a state, of a country, obviously helped by external actors.
I think Farah wants to come in on this, and I think let me make it even more provocative. There are accusations that many of these programs fail because you don't empower the government to implement those projects within their own regions, and sometimes you make the mistake of reaching out too intensely to the communities straight away. I think there are some schools of thought who actually argue this. I would like your view on this.
So the first thing I want to say is a point of clarification, because I don't think I was clear. I didn't say the United States government or any government doesn't have a role to play, nor did I say that it is not an important role. What I said, I wasn't clear, I'm sorry, was that in being the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we hear on the ground, I was assuming that there is a strategy in place and that every country in the world has their own strategy to deploy. On behalf of the United States government, I can say when I was in government, and I'm not anymore, I want to be clear about this, that we were trying to take a leadership role in how we were convening like-minded governments who also wanted to take part in trying to destroy the ideology. So that's extremely important. When you ask the question about where and how things are failing, why is there failure? No country can go into another country and tell them how to do something. Mm-hmm. But there has been very little creativity around how our like-minded partners in this think about where we're going to scale up together. And I think there's where you get the ad hoc. There's where you get your foot's on the gas pedal, and then it goes off and it comes back on again, because it goes along political timelines, and it also goes around what is the shiny thing that we think we're fighting right now. Today it's this group, tomorrow it's that group, rather than understanding that ideology has no borders. and that to have a comprehensive plan at scale, in order for us to succeed, we need to have metrics that show us that if you deploy this kind of all-in attitude in a particular location for a number of years, not months, you're going to be able to see change, and we haven't invested in that.
Raffaello, let me come to you. We love death as you love life. Britain, suburban terrorists. Europe has a problem, and certainly London and UK is grappling with a similar challenge. How do you, sitting in that particular continent, see the dimensions of this challenge? And for you, what would be the key responses to countering violent extremism?
Well, first of all, let me also add my thanks to Samir, ORF, and the hosts for kindly inviting me here to join this very interesting panel. I mean, you've asked a very big question, as all the questions you've been posing on this panel, and there is no clean and quick answer. But I would respond in some ways by picking up on this conversation that we've just been having about the role of government within countering violent extremism. Because within a British context, and I think you can find this across other European countries as well, there is a view you will find that says that actually the role of government in some of these CVE programs probably blunts their effectiveness. If you have a community-based program, and within that community-based program, there is, there's some excellent imam or, I don't know, a lawyer in some community in East London who's doing some fantastic work on the ground with his local kids, steering them way onto the right path. Maybe before he was more focused on gangs, now he's moved into this space, and he's doing some really excellent work there. As soon as people in that local community start to hear that he's getting money from the government to help him do this work, it reduces his credibility. And it suddenly means that what was an effective sort of inoculator within that specific community is actually no longer as effective as it was before. So the dilemma in that context is, what can government do to support this particular program without actually being seen to support this program? So I understand within the context of a country like Afghanistan how clearly you do need some sort of greater central coordination, you do need something sort of driving out from the center, but in a European context, it's sort of completely the other way around. And this brings me to another sort of interesting point, or I think it's an interesting point, which struck me when I looked at the title of what you're talking about here. When I think of sort of terrorism and violent extremism in a European context, it's very difficult to sort of rationalize it against the idea of insurgency. Now, when I'm sitting there looking at what we saw happening in Ireland for many years in the United Kingdom, or what we saw happen with ETA in Spain, or Corsican extremists in France, I can see insurgency as a sort of explainer for it. It's an adjective that works within that sort of context. But in a lot of other contexts, when I look at the sort of individuals I was talking to, or I'm talking about in the book that I wrote looking at Britain's suburban jihad in particular, which is available on Amazon, I might add, we're talking instead about individuals who I would say are much more driven by a kind of anti-establishment narrative. These are young people who are basically, and this is the other interesting wrinkle I would add, is it's not only young people anymore. If I look at the sort of people who I've seen being drawn off to fight in Syria and Iraq now, it's men, it's women, it's very young people. We've seen very young teenagers being drawn, but we've also seen older people who've been sort of engaged in these sorts of extremist groups and ideas for, almost 20 years now. So it's a really broad community of people that you're looking at. It's lots of individual motivations that probably fit more under the kind of anti-establishment narrative than necessarily they do within the sort of context of some sort of globalist ideology, when you sort of dig down into the individual's motivations. And so the kind of response to that becomes very difficult to have a sort of universal, catch-all response, which is going to deal with all these problems at the same time. Which then brings me to another sort of aspect, which I think often comes up, and this isn't something you particularly mentioned now, but you mentioned it before when we were talking about it, which is the question of integration. This is often one of the things that people talk about in a European...
Actually, I wanted to come to that.
Yes.
I wanted to pose that particular question to you, because they say Europe is grappling with the 3 Rs, radicalism, Russia, and the right. I think these are the 3 things that are playing out at the same time, and I think Farah mentioned that they were, initially the CVE program was a response to the right in Europe, not necessarily the radical Islam challenge. So in London, what does the rise of the right do to the subterranean jihadis that you are speaking to? How does that implicate?
Well, I mean, there's a concept called reciprocal radicalization, which says that you've got sort of 2 extremes, and you've got on the one side violent Islamists, and on the other side you've got the extreme right wing. And the extreme right wing narrative is that, we are being invaded by Muslims, we've got these migrant hordes coming in, we need to stand up and fight against them. And on the other side of the equation, you've got violent Islamists who say that this country rejects you because of your Muslim identity, and then they look at the sort of violence that far-right groups are saying and say, look, it's not just me saying this, it's actually happening. Look at people like, you know, Tommy Robinson or some other sort of extreme right-wing groups that we see in a sort of European context. So these two narratives very much need each other. I mean, I remember talking to, you know, extremist recruiters who quite openly said, you know, if there wasn't, you know, racism in these countries, it would be quite difficult for me to recruit people. The very fact that you have got this sort of racism existing within these communities means that it's much easier for me to say, you know, there is an other. You are treated and seen as an other, and therefore you must join my cause because we're fighting together to try to bring justice to the world.
The us versus them that Farah was alluding to. Let me come to Assan. Assan, the CVE specialist for the Commonwealth. And this, of course, I mean, I would certainly like for you to share your work in the Commonwealth countries and how are they grappling or responding to some of the challenges that they're witnessing. But of course, you also have an experience with the UK. And how does your learning in UK, how is it relevant to your work in many of these different geographies?
Okay, so firstly, thank you for inviting me here. Good evening, everyone. So I've worked on PVE in the UK for about 10 years or so, and then working in the Commonwealth Secretariat's new CV unit for about a year and a half now. So one of the things I should say is when I go across Commonwealth countries, the UK's model is seen as something that works really well, and people generally say they'd like to understand the framework a bit more, which obviously is a good thing. I think on the ground, as Raffaello mentioned earlier, there are some challenges. So for example, if someone's doing some good work on the ground, non-government person, and then the government wants to get involved, then their credibility is impacted sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. So then that brings me on to what we do at the Commonwealth. So I'm going to talk about, I guess, the Caribbean and my work, particularly in the Caribbean. I mean, I've worked in a number of different countries, but I'll focus on the Caribbean, particularly Trinidad. So in Trinidad, what's happened is the Commonwealth, so there's been other agencies working there on CV, the US, UK, Australia, etc. And we've gone in last year, June 2017. And we've gone in as the Commonwealth, and some of you here may be thinking, why on earth is the Commonwealth engaged in CV? So the Commonwealth is generally known for work around, well, actually, rather than going into the long speech, the best way to describe it is the Commonwealth is like the UN, but a lot poorer, and we sort of work with 53 countries, soon to be 54, if things go well for Zimbabwe, and it might be growing and growing. So we're a lot poorer than the UN, and we have a very modest budget, funded very kindly by the UK and Australia for 3 years, and we're a year and a half into our current mandate. So we've gone into Trinidad, and the government, I guess two things I should say is, one is we have a unique, I guess, leverage points. One is we have good contacts with governments, and the other is we have good contacts on the ground. So we've gone in as a very credible, neutral actor. So for example, I went in and spoke to, apart from government, a number of Muslim communities on the ground. And initially, they're like, you know, who are you? What's the Commonwealth all about? All we know is, you know, you guys do the Commonwealth Games, et cetera, et cetera. So we've gone into the explanation about what the Commonwealth does. The other thing I should say is, I've been told quite a lot, I look Trinidadian. So I go in there and they're like, you must be one of us. Then I open my mouth and I sound like a Londoner, which I'm sure you've all probably guessed. I should actually say, I do digress a lot, so obviously you might have to pull me back a bit. My name's Assan, A-S-S-A-N. Born and raised in London. My parents are from Assam. And that wasn't a typo by them. It's actually, and my fellow Indians and Asians will recognize this, my brother's called Hassan, and I'm called Assan, and sometimes there's a rhyming thing going on with Asian families. So Assan, Hassan are two brothers. Anyway, I digress. Sorry, I wanted to get that out there. So where was I? Yeah, so we've gone in on the ground, and what's happened is the Muslim community have, in general, received us really well. So initially, there's a little bit of like, who are these guys? You know, what are they all about? But we've gone in and they really want to engage with us. So we've run a number of programs now since last year on the ground, a lot, but particularly focused with the Muslim community. And that's gained a lot of traction. And one of the things is when I talk to different Muslim communities, leaders or activists on the ground, they say they're a bit skeptical about what this organization's agenda is, or this organization's agenda, including their own government. Some of them say including their own government. So we've gone in, and it's like a bit of a mediator, broker, facilitator type role. And one of the things I should say is the Commonwealth CV unit, we see ourselves as CV facilitators, CV connectors. There was a phrase coined by our Secretary General, and she said, we are like the Match.com of the CV world. And what I would say as we're in India is we're like the Shadi.com of the CV world. We connect different CV actors together so they can... There was a comment made about donor coordination. In Trinidad, that is a bit of a challenge, but I have to say through not just us, but through us being a credible actor, being able to leverage government and also CSOs on the ground, we've got to the point now where we have a lead agency now in Trinidad and Tobago government, who is going to be the lead coordinator for all CV work. The strategy should be coming out very, very soon. So going in as a friendly face, not a CT think tank or a CT actor directly, we've gained a lot of ground, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, and it sort of touches on the point that was made around if government gets involved, sometimes it's seen as a negative. In our case, we've gone in as a non-intergovernmental organization, and we've kind of been able to sort of marry up, to use that word, all the key agencies required to start the process of preventing and countering violent extremism.
Let me ask you another question. So when you go into these communities, do you think by the very act of engaging with them on something such as violent extremism, have you seen them becoming more aware of their identity? Do you sometimes create the us versus them by actually creating programs in places which may not be terribly affected by that? Do you think it also, in a sense, makes them more acutely aware of something happening? And therefore, while you're trying to be the Shadi.com of the CV world, there might be a connection happening to the violent world.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. And if I can sort of give an example from the UK. So I remember hearing a long time ago in Wales, there was an incident with regards to members of the Yemeni community. And a particular delegation from government went over to Wales to visit that Yemeni community. And the Yemeni community leaders said, we've been here over 100 years and you've just come to visit us now. So you're looking at us through preventing violent extremism or CT lenses. In Trinidad and Tobago, I would say the context, there's a lot of context. I'm reading a book currently by an academic called, the title's really in big white fonts, which says Jihad in Trinidad and Tobago. I sat on the plane reading it, and the air steward went past and did a bit of a double take and looked at me, and I said, don't worry, it's a good book, yeah, don't chuck me off the plane. But it was a good plane, so I wouldn't get chucked off that plane. But anyway, that's another story. So in Trinidad and Tobago, what's happened is the issue of identity is interesting. So there you have, I grew up in London from a South Asian community, and I'm second generation. My parents came in the 60s, 70s to London. And the issue of identity is interesting because I grew up with racism, being a victim of racism, and now it's moved on to, more faith-based identity issues as opposed to ethnic-based identity issues. In Trinidad and Tobago, what is really interesting for me is, and I need to do more and more research on this, is the Indo and the Afro-Trinidadians have been there well over 130 years. Mm-hmm. There's always, not every single person, but there is, it's well known, documented in research reports and papers, that there is a bit of an intra-community tension and a lack of cohesion between the Indo and the Afro community. Not everyone, but it is there. So for me, I kind of think, if in growing up in the UK, we've been there 40, 50 years, and there's that issue around community tensions and lack of integration, identity issues. In Trinidad, if the community has been there well over 100 years, why is that still there? Why is there still inter-community tension? And by us working on CV, does it get people to start thinking about, are we Indo-Trinidadians? Are we Afro-Trinidadians? Are we Indian Trinidadian Muslims, or are we just Trinidadian? Some have said to me, we're just Trinidadian. regardless of their background. Some are very clear what they are in terms of they're Muslim first, and we hear that a lot in the UK. You know, are you Muslim, British, Bengali, Indian, Pakistani? What comes first? And then some people say we don't think like that. We know there's no. Don't think outside the box. There is no box. You know, some people think like that, and then some people say, actually, no, we're Muslim first. That's it. End of story. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's really complex, and it depends on where you go. And one thing I should add before you know, I do talk a lot, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, is with the Commonwealth, we go in, and it was a point mentioned earlier, we go into different countries, and we don't go there and say, we're the Commonwealth, we're based in London, and we're going to tell you what to do. I was in Bangladesh about a month ago, and I told a friend of mine in London, and he's British Bangladeshi, and he said, so what do you do when you go to Bangladesh? Do you go and tell them this is what you need to do? And I said, far from it, we don't do that. I mean, I don't certainly do that. We've got a very small team of 3, we certainly don't do that. What we do is we go in, and we talk to government officials and people on the ground and do our bit of research, but we talk about how we can help each other. So with Bangladesh, they're very keen on learning more about the UK counterterrorism framework, and as I mentioned earlier, it's known, I guess, quite widely as a good framework to work to, but also the Bangladeshis wanted to share with us how they've countered violent extremism, particularly since the big attack in 2016 in Dhaka, in their capital. So we don't go in saying, this is what you need to do, we know it all. We learn, we share, and that's our approach.
I think that's a good segue to the next round of questions that I want to, actually the same question I want to pose to all of you before I turn to the audience for their interventions this evening. Sharing of frameworks, sharing of experiences. Have we created an international network that facilitates this? How we, I mean, you're very clear, Farah, that we have failed. But do you think that there is something that we can do which will allow the mapping and sharing of national, regional, community experiences, the role of community leaders and women and children, and the relationship and the dynamic within the community, and finally, the South Asian, Southeast Asian experiences? Have we teased them out enough to create models and templates that are exportable or shareable with others? So Farah, let me start with you. I think, again, it's a big question. You all have 2 minutes each for this, and then I'll turn to the audience.
So I'm going to say 3 things. The first is, if you're doing CVE correctly, you're going in and you're knitting together really great ideas. You're connecting the person in Oslo with the person in Nouakchott, Mauritania, because they're doing the same thing. And being able to build those kind of networks means that you need to listen on the ground. For governments, it means you need to be able to understand the black holes that you have not filled. And that's my first point. So how can we achieve scale? How can we do more? It isn't just doing more of the same thing. It is understanding the dynamics that have to shift and to invest in the things that already have promise and scale them up. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is where is all of this us versus them ideology coming forward? Who's funding it? How's it getting there? And in the modern context of post 9/11, if we do not talk about Saudi Arabia, and we haven't yet, surprisingly, it's been an hour. Why haven't we talked about Saudi Arabia? We are failing. And so one of the things that we have to do as government is to listen to what civil society is saying about where and how their young people are getting these different ideologies, how they're learning about Islam, what kind of Qurans they're reading, what kind of textbooks they're reading, and what kind of preachers are teaching to them. And if you don't come to the conclusion that we need to do more as government to call out Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries that have provided a platform for this for the last 30 to 40 years, we will continue to fail. So that is my second point. What more can we do? And my third point is this. I think that as we listen to people talking about best practices and what we need to do, I failed in telling you one of the things that I think is very important and I'll just speak from the American perspective. We have not invested. There's research that's gone into CVE over the course of the last almost 16 years, 17 years since 9/11 has happened. We have debunked all this idea of it's economy, it's poverty, it's education, it's this, this, and this. It comes down to identity. But even though great research has gone into this and we have great data, what we haven't done is to spend time on the behavioral psychologists who should be working with our government on the child and adolescent minds so that we can understand what promise is available to us. So I can criticize my own country in doing that. I don't know what every other country represented in this room has done around the child and adolescent mind, but that's something else that we can do in a much better way and a more dynamic way. So those are my three interventions.
Raffaello, let me ask you, pretty much on the same line, but have we as a global community agreed to what is radical or what is radicalism? And therefore, and as a corollary, can we have coordination between national responses or local responses if we cannot agree to the definition of radicalization or what constitutes radical ideology?
I mean, I've sat through, I can't tell you how many conferences, academic discussions which have tried to define these things, and the discovery is that it's really difficult to do because we all have different kind of interpretations. I actually don't know if there actually is some utility to that. What I would say, however, is there are some frameworks which do exist internationally, which have succeed and have been useful. There is the Hidayah Center, which is created in the UAE. There is the Global Counterterrorism Forum. And I think where these are useful in terms of sharing best practice, but by best practice, I think what's most useful to think about is the terms of how do we qualify, how do we understand success? How do we measure success in some of these programs? If you look at how different programs around the world have tried to measure success or understand best practice and offer ideas for how others might explore it, that is, I think, a useful frame that you can see and does, I think, exist at a sort of international level. I think the other thing which is really important is, and Farah kind of touched upon this a little bit in some of her comments, you know, there are other things which we have done which do work in a sort of cooperative way. If we look at terror financing, and I'm not talking about states necessarily, but I'm talking about more international financial institutions, how money flows around the system, you know, how that sort of clamped down. And that's something that I think there has been some cooperation on internationally. There is still more that can be done. Cyber, if we think about how ideologies spread online and how different countries have used different approaches to try to deal with some of these things, those again are examples of best practice which are pretty universal. I think if you're getting down to the nitty-gritty of why an individual in Afghanistan is deciding to join a group like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda and comparing that to the experience of why a kid in South London or East London is trying to do the same thing, you know, you're really going to struggle to try to find some unifying element between all of those and therefore be able to draw a lesson out from that which would be completely universally applicable. So I think there we're kind of chasing a bit of a unicorn to some degree. But I think the other final element I'd add, which is an important one always to remember, is there is politicians have a tendency sometimes to say things that can make the situation worse. And I think that is something that our politicians, and this is, I think, a universal issue. I certainly see it in the United Kingdom. I think some of the statements that our government has made, I think some of the statements other European governments have made around some of these problems are frankly making the situation worse because they're exacerbating the very clash of civilizations narrative that drives a lot of these groups and ideologies. So making sure we're not doing that is, I think, a really important first step.
Let me go to Assan right now, and then I'll finally come to Arian. Assan, what can we do better? What can the Commonwealth do better in responding to this particular aspect?
So I think, so I guess one of our approach, and I think I've touched upon it earlier, is we don't go into a country and say, this is what you need to do. So we sort of actively do something.
Okay, let me ask you a more difficult question directly. Do you think everyone in the Commonwealth is as committed to this issue? I think that's an important question to ask because you mentioned the UK and Australia are funding this initiative. So let me ask you the direct question. That do you believe there is a buy-in from the larger community of the Commonwealth to respond to this particular challenge?
No, I mean, obviously we thank the UK and the Australians for funding us, but I don't think that necessarily means that they're only, I guess, technically bought into this our program. I think everyone's bought in their own particular ways. So working in East Africa, working across Africa, but in particularly East Africa, there's a different type of buy-in, and the buy-in differs depending on which country you go to. So I think going forward, what we want to do more of, and this is a way of, I guess, supporting the work we're doing in the Commonwealth, is we not only want to help countries that perhaps have a challenge like Trinidad in the Caribbean, but we also want to see which countries have good systems and structures in place that we can support them to take that over to different countries. So for example, India may be doing really well in X area of PCV. We might say we'd like to facilitate your systems and structures in either one of your neighboring countries, in an African country, or in a country that has a very similar context to yourselves. So that's our approach.
Arian, what can the world do better? And how will that help Afghanistan particularly, and many other regions which are responding to this on a daily basis, on a regular basis, more effectively?
Well, as it's clear, we are in a unique position right now. I mean, the battleground, the battle space for us is very much different. The depth and breadth of the threat that we are facing currently is very much different from pretty much anywhere else in the world. Last month, we were actively fighting in 27 provinces out of 34. Currently, it's more or less the same. I'm Director of National Threat Assessment. On average, we get between 450 and 550 threats nationwide. We managed to at least subdue 75 to 80% of that. But even 20% of that taking place is getting us where we are right now. So it is different. However, I still believe that there's a lot that could be done through international cooperation, and I'm going to copy Farah and mention 3 areas. One, in the area of fighting the ideology. I mean, there are a lot of countries and a lot of communities worldwide that can help us fight and counter the appeal to this ideology. Last month, we had a gathering of Afghan, Pakistani, and I'm just forgetting the name of that country, I'm sorry, Malaysian scholars in Malaysia. There was a 2-day conference, and they had some good declarations. I think copying that and doing that elsewhere in the world at the ideological level will be helpful. Number 2 is more on the practical realm. We have intelligence that fighters and violent extremists are moving all the way from the Middle East into Afghanistan using various routes. So cooperation, tight cooperation between countries, between states, in identifying these individuals and groups and preventing those routes certainly will be a helpful task. And then finally, sharing of resources. Yes, we are fighting in Afghanistan, but the war that we are fighting is no longer a civil war. We are currently fighting against 20 active terrorist groups, only one of which is Afghan. 19 of the terrorist groups that are fighting on our soil right now against our people are actually foreign groups. Everything from ETIM of the Chinese to IMU of Uzbekistan to Jandullah of Tajikistan to LET of Pakistan to a host of terrorist groups that are actually not Afghan nationals fighting. So this is actually a regional war. It's a global war only fought in Afghanistan. We just happen to be at the forefront of that. So sharing of resources, sharing of knowledge would be a third area that I believe would be an effective way of cooperation.
Do you sometimes feel that all this energy and political capital being spent on creating this response which tries to capture or recapture hearts and minds, prevent hearts and minds from going into certain territories which are dangerous, do you think it detracts from your immediate effort sometimes?
I don't think it does. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that any potentially effective approach has to be comprehensive. It has to be a whole of society approach. We cannot only rely on the kinetic aspect of counterterrorism. Yes, that's where the bulk of our resources and our efforts and our blood is spent, but that's mainly because we are facing this grave threat right now. However, I don't believe that the CT approach, the military approach to CT that we have right now is the ultimate solution. I mean, it may be subduing some of the threats right now. It may be preventing the enemy from taking us over, but ultimately it has to be a more comprehensive approach. Okay. The root causes have to be addressed.
So we are going to open it up now. There are 4 mics here and you can just walk up. I can see Anand, I can see Kabir, you can just walk up to the mics nearest to you. There are 4 of them here. And I would like you to pose questions or make short comments, not to give presentations. Yeah, because we've not allowed any of them to make any presentations this evening. So Anand, go ahead.
Hi, can one be blunt?
Yeah, you can absolutely be blunt. Right. You're being recorded, it's all for everyone to see, so go ahead and be blunt.
All right, I think as the Navajo saying goes, you can't pretend, you can't wake a person who's pretending to be asleep. I think what we're doing right now is criticizing the fundamentalists, not criticizing the fundamentals. The problem is, as you would realize, that the biggest peddler of fake news and the biggest mainstreaming of hate and intolerance are our religious books. So yet again, we fall into this trap of criticizing the people who are reading the religious books and becoming fundamentalists, but not criticizing the fundamentals. And the problem that comes with this is that both the moderates and the extremists are reading the same book. This is akin to a scientist reading The Origin of Species, written by Darwin, and that includes some chapters written by a creationist. The problem is the moderates provide the cushion for the extremists. So what I would like the panel to talk about is the following. As we know, about 2 weeks ago, France decided, or people in France decided to ban or remove 100-odd quotes from Quran that were anti-Semitic in nature, that were anti-infidel in nature, that were homophobic in nature, and they were cowed down by vociferous protests. So I want to ask you is, why do you not criticize the fundamentals, but criticize the fundamentalists? Thank you.
Who wants to take that? I think maybe a couple of you would want to respond to that. Farah, would you like to take that on? You were the special rep to the community.
So, sir, I didn't get your name.
Anand.
Anil?
Anand.
Anand Ranganath.
Nice to meet you. I have to apologize because I'm not sure I quite understand the connection between what you were saying about what was taking place in France. The French government has banned portions. The government of France has banned portions of...
No, not the government.
I see, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there was this thing amongst the intellectuals in France.
The intellectuals?
Yes.
Who do you mean, sir?
Well, there was a band of about, I think, 50-odd. I mean, France is adept at, celebrating its intellectuals. And there was this band of 50-odd people who wanted to remove 100-odd quotes from Quran.
And how many people live in France?
80 million.
How many Muslims are in France?
That is laïcité, so they won't tell you.
I know that. I know that. But my point is this, not to poke fun. I just mean this. I think it is really hard to respond to your question in an abstract kind of way. Mm-hmm. So if you will allow me to answer a little bit more broadly.
Sure.
I do agree that the conversation on the panel today didn't go into every single aspect of the problem that we face. I do think Samir did a terrific job in trying to poke at a lot of different elements of what we're facing. And I'm sure over the next couple of days, we're going to get to the different contours. So I don't think it's fair to say we didn't cover it. We weren't asked it, but since you did say this, I've been working on this issue since 9/11. And I've had the privilege of serving my government doing it, and I've been working on it outside of government. And I know that you are right in saying this, that civil society has a very important role to play in what we absorb, who we are, what we stand for. But as an American, and somebody who believes in democracy, and believes in our freedom of speech, I think it is vital and extremely important that we have the capacity to talk through a lot of the complicated terminology around things that the so-called intellectuals may or may not be right about. I also believe in freedom of faith and understand that 1.6 billion Muslims in the world are not all the same. They are not one big monolith, and there are lots of contours around that. So when you say those kinds of things, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable answering, because I don't want to be that person who gives you a bland statement about something that's so broad. So my point is this. While there is merit in what you're saying about the kind of conversation we must have around how extremists define religion and how those who absorb the environment and communities that they have a larger role to play, I will say that it is not just about what is written in holy books, and that is in across the board. It is about what you were saying too, about the holistic response of society in general, and what we stand for, and who we are, and the dignity we give all people.
Raffaello, you want to come in on that?
No, I mean, I agree with Farah. I think she put it very eloquently, quite frankly, and I would certainly agree with everything she said. The other point I would make in a British context in particular is when you look at a lot of the individuals who become involved in these extremist ideas and purport to be fighting on behalf of Islam, and you ask them about the very religion they claim to be ready to go and murder other people and to die for, they have a very shallow, if any, understanding of this religion at all. You know, and so it's very difficult to be able to blame the religion when you talk to the individuals and it's very clear that they have absolutely no idea about this religion they can be fighting for. The other point is that when we're talking about a counter-terrorism strategy or counter-violent extremism strategy in a European context, you aren't just dealing with violent Islamists. You are dealing with others. You are dealing with the extreme right wing, which you've mentioned already, and there are others as well one can find.
Do you want to comment on this, Arian? No? Okay. Anand, you'll have 2 days to discuss this. I know you're not convinced by the responses, but you'll have 2 days to discuss this. We'll come back to your question. Kabir.
Hi, my name is Kabir Taneja. I'm with the ORF. We've been discussing, I'm completely shifting from here, but we've been discussing CVE as a theory and a concept, right? And a lot of it has, as we've
actually
discussed,
practice as well, because you've been hearing them tell, you know.
Yeah, sure.
Tell
But I'm just sort of drawing on the theory and practical, of course, the practical side of it as well. But we've been discussing a lot of how it's implemented, and a lot of it is based on access, right? So access to geography, access to communities of areas and places that are under conflict. For I mean, just to say, for an example. But how do you see this theory standing, or how do you see these concepts behind CVE standing in a place like China, for example? Or how would you describe a place like Xinjiang, and then try to put all these concepts together and implement it in that sort of place? Or just explain, implement it is a really far off term, but just explain CVE and the concepts behind it in a place like Xinjiang.
So how do you come up with CVE strategies for ungoverned and or inaccessible spaces? I think both of them work. China is one example, but there are many other battlefields where we don't have access to communities to go in and use some of what we have learned elsewhere and apply it there. Who wants to take that? Raffaello, you want to come in?
I'd be happy to. I mean, I think it's a really difficult question. I mean, and you mentioned the China example in particular. We've done a lot of work in China at my think tank at RUSI, looking at some of these questions there, and it's really challenging because there, you know, I can't remember exactly who said this. I suspect everyone probably mentions at some point. You know, it is questions of identity. You know, it's people's sense of identity and losing their identity and not being able to express their identity, and a sort of fundamental sense of injustice. And when you look at what's happening in China and you see that these people are feeling that very anger, and then you try to talk to the Chinese government and they say, you know, even if you can get through to them to explain to them that this is a problem, and actually I have met people who do seem to get it, it so kind of fundamentally clashes then with the broader political construct that does exist within the country. It becomes very difficult for them to manage. And then the other issue within the Chinese context in particular is to remember the size of China, right, which is a country of 1.4 billion people, of which Uyghurs, the ethnic minority we're talking about in Xinjiang province, is 10 million people. So to China, to have your to change your entire country's sort of, you know, orientation and geography and, you know, national identity structure to try to deal with this small minority community who live in the fringes of it, it's an almost impossible challenge for them to do, which is why I think you've seen them go in the other direction, which I fear, I don't know if there's any Chinese here in the audience, but, you know, I fear that the way they're dealing with it at the moment may actually be making it worse.
I'm going to come to Farah, but I am also putting Arian on notice because I want to ask you a variant of that question. How do you come up with CE programs in areas where the government has no sway? So Farah.
So just a quick two-finger on the issue of China. It isn't just about the Uyghurs. Let's remember the way people have been part of the history of Islam in China for over 1,000 years. And I think that's very important. And when I was in China in 2010, as special representative, it was very complicated, you can imagine, as an American representative in China, navigating through some of these things. But I think you're asking such a great question. And one of the things that shocked me, and this is a pitch for my book, I tell a story in the book that I think is going to freak out the Chinese, and I'm never going to be allowed in that country again. But you know, what are they doing in terms of understanding the diversity of their own Muslim populations and the story and the narrative of what it means to be a Chinese Muslim? Because it's a very, as you know, a very interesting one. And I say that because I was absolutely shocked when I was in Kunming to see the influence of Saudi Arabia on the Hui people. Mm-hmm. So it isn't just the ungoverned spaces, so to speak, it's also what's happening right in front, the building of mosques, the so-called Islamic universities and schools that have been popping up left and right that are funded not by the state of, you know, of China, but the foreign money that's coming in and what that is eventually going to do. So I'm really happy you raised China. I think it's a really important question.
Arian.
Again, I mean, it's a very difficult question to really answer. We face this problem both inside our country and outside of our country. Inside of our country, there are certain areas where we don't have control, where the insurgents are in control, and there are other parts where none of us are fully in control. So some of the issues that one would like to do as part of a CVE strategy which require direct access to the people is impossible to do. Other issues are possible to do. For instance, we have a unified school curriculum. And now, even in places that we don't directly control, the schools are there, and that same curriculum is being taught. Now, changing and adapting our curriculum based on our CVE efforts will have an impact there. Access to certain other fundamentals, such as healthcare, we have found that that is actually linked to violent extremism, and that is allowed even in areas that we don't fully control. But the main problem that we have actually when it comes to the issues of ideology and radicalization is with this issue of madrasas, the religious madrasas, and that the madrasas are the main platform for radicalization, and most of those madrasas that actually do radicalize individuals, Afghan individuals, are not inside of our country. It's inside of one of our neighboring countries. And we have absolutely no control, no access to those madrasas. We cannot do anything in there. This entire other phenomenon of the Fatimiyun, Lashkar Fatimiyun, the Fatimiyun army, and those are basically the Afghan Shias that are fighting in the Middle East, in Syria and in Iraq. Those are, again, being recruited, being radicalized, trained by certain other government in that region. And when it is outside of our territory, we have absolutely no control. So those are the stuff that we currently can't do anything about, unfortunately.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take two short interventions from the two young boys I can see on my left. And we are going to then come back to you for your final comments and close this panel and go and have a well-deserved dinner. So go ahead, sir.
Yeah, hello, good evening to all. I'm Carl Jason. I'm a student of South Asian University. So at one level, we have to see how tackling insurgent ideologies would prevent the youth from being indoctrinated by this. But what does CVE has to say on people who have already been indoctrinated, and especially with reference to foreign fighters who return back to their countries? And so it raises the issue of reintegrating them into society. So what does CVE has to say on, I'm sorry, I'll just...
We got your question. How do you reintegrate those who have been converted? The second gentleman there, please come to the mic and ask a question. Introduce yourself, ask a question, and then I'm going to go to the panel.
Good evening. My name is Hafiz, and I'm from NIT Srinagar. My question is to Arian that there is a narrative going on in Kashmir that Afghanistan government is a puppet of US government. How would you counter that?
So the Afghan government is a puppet of the US government,
Actually, you
and
said
that
that
itself
you are concerned-
delegitimizes many of the efforts. Fair enough. So I've got your question. Someone else, I saw another young hand there. Irfan, you want to come in quickly?
Are there no women? Seriously?
Any women asking questions, please?
Females? None?
Last year,
There are many, but I don't think. Yeah, go ahead. Go to the mic there.
okay. Last year in Kabul, I interviewed 50 students from different
Quick,
okay,
because, yeah.
Islamic madrasas, and I asked them whether they support Islamic law, which is in Afghanistan, or Sharia. And 50 of them answered they support Sharia. So I agree that most of the radicalization take place in neighboring countries, but what about this situation? And the question is why the government, do not regulate or dog those madrasas, especially in Kabul.
We have understood your question.
Yeah.
What is the government doing about the situation at
In
home?
Kabul.
It's easy to blame your neighbors, but what are you doing within your own communities? Final intervention this evening.
Yeah, mine is just a very quick comment, and that's on the issue of reciprocal radicalisation that got mentioned. And I'll just raise that actually, if you look at a lot of the Islamist groups and the far-right groups, their narratives are actually very similar. They're very anti-integration. They actually think that the Islam is incompatible with the West. And so I think if we frame it around this kind of binary reciprocal radicalisation, we actually, we're quite reductive, and we lose a lot of the nuances and a lot of the different influences that are pressuring on the radicalization issue.
Great. And let me now start with Raffaello and come down to, and you will have the final word this evening. I'll start with Raffaello and we'll come down the panel. Raffaello, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think some of these questions are directed to us. I think on the point about reciprocal radicalization, I take your point that, there is more nuance to it than that. It's certainly not a sort of binary, one's completely reactive to the other, but I do think they do feed off each other to some degree and do certainly, I think, make each other's worse. I think on the first point around what do we do about people who are, what does countering violent extremism have to say about, for example, foreign fighters who've gone off to fight or people who already engage with these groups, I think we need to think about that more within the frame of disengagement. And you need to think about it more within the frame of how do we steer people, once you've taken on an idea like that. Once you've absorbed this sort of idea, you've decided this is what I want to go participate in, it's very difficult to ever get you to completely shake that idea. Once we have ideas, and once we believe them, and once we've done action towards them, it's very difficult for someone else to sit there and just through talking, you persuade you that you've got to reject this sort of fundamental idea that you've absorbed. And so I think within that context, you have to think much more within the context of disengagement, trying to steer people off that path. Yes, you can hold radical ideas. Radical ideas are fine. I think, as Farah said, we live in open, democratic societies. We should all be allowed to express ourselves. But if those ideas are going to violence, then that's a problem. If you can stop it or you can steer them off that direction, then that, I would argue, is probably as good as you're going to get in some of those cases.
Arian, there were a couple of questions directed at you.
Yes, I believe I had two questions. One, this issue of the narrative of the American invasion. I mean, obviously, it's an issue of propaganda that is being pumped by the enemy, and it's pretty easy to counter. It is being countered. It is clear that what we have with the United States is based on legal documents, legal agreements done by two sovereign states. So it's no invasion, it's just a cooperation. Secondly, if you were to ask the majority of normal Afghans, even in the countryside, still the majority of people support the US presence there because they know that that is an absolute necessity right now. I mean, as a normal Afghan, well, I'm not a normal Afghan, I work in the government, but I'm in touch with a lot of normal Afghans. Trust me, the bulk of the people truly support the US, the NATO presence, the coalition presence in the country. We, in some of our talks with the Taliban, with the enemy, in fact, we posed that question the same question to them. I mean, we have legal binding documents that we have cooperation, clearly drawn lines with Europe and with the United States. But they are the ones bringing 19 terrorist organizations into the country. They're bringing the Arabs, they're bringing the Chinese, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, you name it, there are nationalities in there. And those are the people that are actually the terrorists that keep night and they're killing our people. So that's just an issue of propaganda being pumped by the enemy. There is not a lot of substance to it. This issue of Sharia and madrasa, well, first of all, let me clarify that our constitution and our laws are in no way contradictory to Sharia. So Sharia has been adapted into our constitution and the laws. Our constitution, in fact, clearly says that no law shall be passed in the country that would be in direct contradiction with the Sharia. So that I wanted to clarify. And in terms of the madrasas, yes, of course, there are a lot of unregistered madrasas inside Afghanistan, some of which maybe, we don't know yet correctly, maybe they are radicalizing individuals. But efforts are underway to register all the madrasas, to regulate all the curricula taught in the madrasas. However, how long it's going to take for us to do that is still an issue of question.
Farah.
So most of the things have been answered, but I want to go to the question. You said something like, what is the role of CVE in making sure that CVE isn't about the endeavor of bringing people back and figuring out where to place them. That is not countering violent extremism. Okay, I want to be clear about that. But if you're asking the question of what one does with people who come back who have already been radicalized, governments need to do more to get former extremists in front of them and work very closely with those extremists who have come back so that that we begin to work on, as I talked about, the mental health issues around what they've dealt with in the battlefield, what's happening in their mind, and the greatest and strongest voice to bring someone back off of the road of extremism is a former extremist. And what we have got to do is find more ways of bringing those people forward in a multitude of ways to make sure that their viewpoints and their understanding is a one-on-one connection with those who have been radicalized.
And have you seen any significant role of the families now in this particular
There's a huge role in families. We didn't talk about families, but what's happening in the home is obviously really important. Both, I want to say this, there's an entire panel on mothers, and I'm not going to take away from that.
Right.
But the first sign of change for a child is what a mother sees. And a mother is a child's first teacher. The fact that we have not done more with mothers globally is something you're going to discuss, I know, but I want to say that on the point that you're raising.
You have the final word this evening, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so just on that first question, so there's a number of different programs either been developed or slowly have developed on returnees. So as you know, a number of returnees particularly from Syria, have returned to their home countries. So the Hidayah Center of Excellence are currently developing a program which hopefully will be ready so we can, for example, implement it with some changes and tweaks in Trinidad, for example. In the UK, I'm aware that, for example, children who have returned from sort of war-torn countries are being supported by psychologists who have a speciality with those who have, previously worked with soldiers who have gone and come back with trauma and stuff. So there's that. I know there's a defector program taking place in Kenya. So for example, how to get people away from Al-Shabaab. And it's, as Raffaello mentioned, it's more about disengagement as opposed to changing or trying to sit there and sort of discuss and debate the ideology that they went. And in those particular cases, for example, the ones I've heard in Kenya, they joined because it was more socioeconomic reasons as opposed to believing in the ideology. So sometimes it differs on country to country.
Thanks a lot. I think it's very difficult to sum up this panel, but what we have heard is, I think, three important aspects being highlighted at different points of time. The one is a new, more nuanced, a more flexible, and a more creative approach to the role of government. And of course, it is contextual. It will differ in different geographies, but we need to get that right. It's extremely important to get the role of government right. It is both legitimizing and enabling, as well as delegitimizing and sometimes self-defeating. And I think that's an important aspect. Second, of course, is have we fully exploited the power of communities, of families, of private sector, and of various stakeholders in contributing to this collective challenge. And the fourth and the most important part is international cooperation. In many ways, more about sharing from each other's failures and successes, not necessarily transposing solutions to different geographies. And how does that international framework of platform of of Shadi.com, of connecting the CV specialists? Can we keep up with the connections that are being created with, on the dark side? And I think that's the third challenge. Can our network grow at the same pace to respond to a network that is seemingly having longer legs than ours? And I think that's the third challenge that we spoke about. We'll discuss many of this over the next 1.5 days. Please join me in applauding the panel for their contributions this evening. We will begin at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and at 10:30 we will have the keynote address by Baroness, who's here this evening, and she will speak on the British experience. You heard the Indian perspective from the minister this evening, and I look forward to having you engage with us over the next few days. Please join us for dinner. Thank you.